One of the things that I love about the band is that they're never afraid to just be themselves. Let's give it up for them, by the way. They did just such an excellent job with that. And I'm so appreciative of the way that every one of them uses their gifts and skills to really help us think about the ways that we can truly love each other when we see each other and to take those risks. I'm going to ask you to take a risk this morning because I'm going to ask you a question and ask you to respond, although I will promise you it is not that hard of a question, and it's this. Have you ever had a food that you thought that you hated, and then you tried and realized that you actually like it? Is anyone willing to raise their hand and tell me, I had a food? Yes.
Beets and honeydew.
Beets and honeydew, and you like those now?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, dynamite. Excellent. Yeah, thank you.
Asparagus.
I think there's several people who would say, yeah, that's it as well. Anybody else? One other person? Anyone else have one that they'd like to share? Yes. Cottage cheese, which is a super healthy food. And, I know a lot of people who, when they first see that, they're just like, For me, this food was popcorn. I know. It started, though, when I was a kid, and my sister and I would go over to my grandparents' house, and they would make this huge vat of popcorn. And because my sister really liked it, well, it obviously meant that I had to hate it, right? Maybe you've had that experience before, but it wasn't actually until I was in my 30s that I realized that it wasn't that I didn't like popcorn, it's that I don't like butter. And my grandparents believed that in order to have, I know some of you are like, wow, I'm stopping listening right now. How can you not like butter? But my grandparents believed a small bag of popcorn deserved a whole tub of butter. And so I never really developed the flavor for those little kernels when I was growing up. And I think part of it was that I also didn't realize that it was okay to like something even if my sister liked it, right? That I didn't have to dislike it just because she enjoyed it. But I wonder how often we have all experienced that. Not just with food, but with so many things in our lives, right? That we have someone that we know who tells us that we have to like something or not like something. And so we just kind of follow that routine until maybe we get exposed to someone who has a different thought on it. And we kind of explore it a little bit. And maybe it changes it. Maybe it's someone that you were raised believing a certain set of things because of what your parents told you, or because of what your minister told you, or because of what your teachers told you. And then you started meeting other people who had different experiences. And you were like, that doesn't feel the right way. It's gotten me to thinking lately, what is it that actually causes those changes in our lives about how we feel about the things that we used to feel about? Is it that we're exposed to someone who has a different background? Is it that, maybe we're presented with new information in a new way? Over the course of this summer, we have been exploring this idea largely about how people change and how they evolve as we've been looking at this series called The Good Place. And we've been asking this question, what happens when we die? How does that change? And one of the things throughout the entire show is that there's this constant theme that people are evolving, that people are changing, whether it was realizing that what they thought was the good place was actually just a designed torture chamber that was just done in a different way, or realizing that the people that they thought were bad were actually good, and maybe some of the people they thought were good were actually bad. And like Amanda shared last week so brilliantly about some of the, she did an excellent job, by the way. If you did not go back and listen to her share last week about Jason, you should definitely do that. But one of the things is that you see these changes. And so this morning, we're going to look at a very specific character who probably has one of the easiest ways to change, one of the easiest ways to reset. It's a character by the name of Janet, and she is the informational assistant who appears anytime that her name is said out loud. She's basically like, if I said, hey Siri, or hey, no, actually I'm not gonna do that because I don't want everyone's phones going off. But she's basically like that. You say her name and she shows up. And unlike our cell phones or our computers, every time that she's rebooted, she comes back with a different series of information. She comes back with some new abilities or some new thoughts. For example, the first time that Janet is ever rebooted, she finds out that she actually has the capacity to love. And I want you to take a quick view at this scene where she finds this out. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just learn skills that way, just kind of like go to sleep, reboot the next morning, and have new skills? Actually, I think my favorite line from that entire scene is where Janet says the reason she falls in love with Jason is because he was, quote unquote, a person who was near her. While I feel like that's both a very robotic answer and kind of silly, I also kind of think that there may be a lot more truth to that than we're willing to admit at first glance. In fact, in my experience, one of the main reasons that many of us change is because suddenly we find ourselves in a situation where we are connected to someone who has a different idea about the way the world works than we used to. And that's not to say, by the way, that change is not scary. It often is. In fact, I would say most of the time, these changes are scary. But it's often also for the better. And so today's big thought that I want us to be thinking about as we are exploring this is this. And this is going to take a bit to unpack. So for the next 20 or 25 minutes, we're going to talk about this. But here's the deal. Change is inevitable. But our connection to each other helps determine if that change is confusing or clarifying. Okay? I'll say that again because I think it's really important. I want us to be able to kind of wrap our heads around this. That change is inevitable, but our connection to each other helps determine if that change is confusing or clarifying. With today being June 29th, I don't know if you know this or not, but we're actually celebrating the 18th anniversary of what I believe might have been one of the largest changes in most of our lives. Anybody happen to know what happened 18 years ago today? The what? I did not get married, although that would have been a big change in my life, but maybe not yours. Anybody else have a guess on what happened 18 years ago today? That was 10 years ago this week, by the way. That was this week. Great. 18 years ago today, the iPhone was released. And while you may not think of that as like a big change, I would actually argue that it would almost be impossible for us to oversell how important that really was. Financial Times indicates that the iPhone by itself made Apple around $1 trillion. And if you think about this, the notion that all of a sudden that we have the totality of knowledge in our pockets completely changed the way that we interact with each other, the ways that we think about how we find out information. I mean, I remember the first time I met someone who had an iPhone, and now I'd be hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't have a smartphone, right? Thinking about how much this has revolutionized our world. And like with any change, when this happened, there were certain people who were super excited about it, the ability to settle bar bets about, which player had the most home runs or whatever. And there were certain people like me, I remember being a little bit sad because it meant that I would never be able to go back to a cell phone store and get a free phone, right? And I think that's how it is when it happens with any major change, whether it was the dropping of the iPhone or Janet's reboot, or when we make personal changes, like we decide that we're going to try to live healthier, or we change our relationships, or we get a new job, those kind of things. Every time that we have these changes, it seems like the way that we approach it and the way we understand it has a lot to do with the people that were around at the time. In the Christian Bible, there is a story like this that I actually think details a change that would have been just about as severe for the people that experienced it as it was for our society when the iPhone first came out. And this story shows up in the book of Acts, which if you had a Christian New Testament, it goes like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then Acts. And it's really the story about what was the beginning of people having church, okay? And this wasn't at all like what we think about. There was no auditorium, there was no PowerPoint or anything like that. They were just trying to figure out what it looked like to love the way that Jesus loved the people around them. And in Acts 9, which is the part right before where we're going to be looking at today, there's this dialogue that the people who are trying to be Christians were trying to figure out what that looked like. Okay? So there's this guy named Paul, And he was mostly convinced that he should go talk to everyone who wasn't Jewish with their background, what they would call the Gentiles. And he was going out and encouraging them to follow the path of Jesus. And meanwhile, there was this guy named Peter, and Peter's main focus was people who were Jewish and getting them to follow the Jewish customs, but in the way that Jesus did. Because remember, Jesus wasn't a Christian, Jesus was a Jew. And so he was like, okay, obviously this path is the right way to go. And so as Peter is going around talking to different Jewish communities, he finds himself in this town of Joppa, and that's actually where we're going to be looking at the story taking place that shows up in Acts chapter 10. And it starts by saying this, that Peter went up on the flat roof to pray. And it was about noon, and he was hungry, but while a meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. And I know that seems like a weird thing to do. Maybe he was hungry or maybe he was tired. But before we get too deep into this, I want to share with you a kind of a reality about this word trance. Because remember, when the Bible was written, it wasn't written for people in 2025 who spoke English. It was written largely in Greek for the New Testament. And while most of the time the way that we understand it is pretty similar, this is one of those words that I think is really different. Because I think this word that we translate trance, which is the word ecstasis, has a completely different understanding for this entire story. It's where we get our word ecstasy, right? And so before you start thinking that like Peter was up on the roof like vibing or doing whatever he would be doing, that's not what he was doing here. The word ecstasis, when it is used in the Bible, even by the same person who most people think wrote Acts, which is the book of Luke, there's a story where Jesus heals this paralyzed man. And it says that everyone who saw it had ecstasis. They were amazed. And so we might ask ourselves, why would Peter be sitting on a roof, getting ready to pray, and be in this space of ecstasis? Why would he be so excited about what had been going on? Well, it could be, and I could be wrong about this, but it could be that he was feeling like he had pretty much settled this discussion about whether Christianity should spread mostly to Jews or people who were non-Jews. Because he was getting a lot of confirmation that he was heading in the right direction, that he was following the Jewish customs, and that the thoughts of Christianity that were being spread there were leading to amazing things happening. In fact, in Acts chapter 9, it talks about how he was able to heal a paralyzed person, and then it said that he was able to raise a person who had died from the dead, right? And whether those stories are literal or metaphorical or whatever, I don't know. But what we do know is that it would have seemed very much to be confirming, hey, I'm doing the right thing. Okay, I'm moving in the right direction. In fact, God's on my side too. And that's when the change actually happens that we're going to spend a lot of our time this morning talking about. Because the next set of verses say this, that he, meaning Peter, saw the sky open, and something like a large sheet was let down by its four corners. And in the sheet were all sorts of animals, reptiles, and birds. And then a voice said to him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat them." "No, Lord," Peter declared. "I have never eaten anything our Jewish laws have declared as impure or unclean." Which brings me to our kind of first thought that we're going to look at as we unpack how we engage with change today, and that's this. That when we are doing well, change can feel impossible, irrational, irresponsible, or irrelevant. Okay? That when we're doing well, change can feel impossible, irrational, irresponsible, or irrelevant. And I didn't just pick 4 I words because I'm a pastor and I was raised in a tradition where every sermon had major points that all started with the same letter. But I do think it's a feeling that many of us have, right? I don't know if you're feeling the same way that I am about this, but when things are going well, the last thing I want is for things to change, right? If I'm watching a baseball game and the pitcher is pitching super well, I hate it when the manager pulls the pitcher because of a pitch count or whatever. I'm like, what? They're doing so well, and of course, they end up losing. I'm like, if they would have just stuck that way, it would have been fine. Or when I'm like cruising down the highway and it's like 70 or 75 and I'm just kind of going down, and then all of a sudden the speed limit drops to 35, and you're like, this makes no sense. Why would we have this change? Everything seems to be going well. And while this idea that all food would now be accessible for people would not be shocking for us today. I mean, most of us don't get really pumped up about eating like a reptile burger, right? For Peter, being told, hey, there is this food that everyone now can eat, would have been as shocking for him as for the iPhone to drop or for the speed limit to all of a sudden shrink by half. Because Peter, as a good Jewish man, would have known there are certain customs that you have to follow. And in the direction that they saw the church kind of going, he would have said, yeah, following the Jewish customs of kosher eating, mission critical. It kind of reminds me of when my wife Morgan and I used to live in Morocco. Since 99% or so of the country is Muslim, they follow certain dietary restrictions. In fact, I had a friend there who would self-describe himself as a quote-unquote bad Muslim because he used to drink all the time and party all the time. But one thing he definitely kept was the fact that during Ramadan you fast and you never ever eat pork. He's like, these are the two things that everyone knows. So if I did that, everyone would know immediately that I was a bad Muslim. For Peter to all of a sudden be able to say, like, you can eat anything would have been just jarring. Everything seems to be going well, and now he's told, you can eat all of this. You know, I wonder how often this happens to us when it comes to changes in our lives. We're all about change. We think change is awesome when it directly benefits us. You know, if you order a shirt online and it's supposed to be blue and extra large and it comes and it's small and orange, and you're like, can we trade this out? And they do. We feel like that's a good change. We're happy that they made that change for us. But when a change happens that doesn't directly benefit us, sometimes it feels like, why is this happening? Why, this doesn't feel right. You know, I feel like, and like I said, I could be wrong about this, but it feels like most of the time when this happens, we might find ourselves on the side of Peter. Almost like arguing with God, where God says, all of this is available. And Peter, in the most gutsy move possible, says no, right? When change happens that doesn't feel to benefit us, it makes us quick to oppose it. As I was doing a quick search about this, I found multiple examples around the United States where people have opposed things that would seem to be very intuitive things because it didn't directly benefit them. For example, in one state, they were talking about giving assistance for college to people who had gone through foster care. And one of the people who was interviewed said this, quote, there were people who weren't enthused because, quote, it doesn't benefit me. Or in Michigan, they were talking about maybe fixing a playground and a water fountain at an elementary school that was predominantly black kids. And one of the articles said this, that there is an increased chance that the home district will lose a household's vote as voters may not favor a tax that doesn't directly benefit their own children. And we see this third one all the time, right? Even getting basic DEI training, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And by the way, you should know here at the venues, this is something that we really value. Our staff goes through DEI training regularly. We have people come in from the Glow Center and other places to make sure that we are thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, how important that is. But one scholar wrote this about DEI training, why it's so hard to get it to really take hold. They wrote, one reason for the improper or incomplete implementation of DEI policies is opposition from members of advantaged groups who will not directly benefit from the policies, e.g. men or white people. Look, when change like that happens, it can be really confusing if you are part of the group that has historically been privileged. We might ask ourselves, why would we spend money on that? I don't get anything out of it. Why would it be good if we can just eat all of these different foods? I've been doing fine eating kosher. And I get it, right? The world around us changes, and if it doesn't directly have a connection to us, we might think, let's just forget about it. Let's let it pass. Let's let it go to the side. But I want you to see how God interacts with this when Peter says no. It says this. It says, the voice spoke again, do not call something unclean if God has made it clean. The same vision was repeated 3 times, and the sheet was suddenly pulled up to heaven, and Peter was very perplexed. Checks out. What could this vision mean? I want to make note here that even when we're making changes that benefit other people, sometimes it can be confusing to us, right? Even when things are super clearly communicated, it can be confusing. It's one of the reasons that we put such a high focus here at the venues on doing things like the Q&A time at the end of this teaching, or where there can be a time for you to get together and have a cup of coffee or something with us so we can kind of break down these big conversations. You need to know that when you have big questions, it puts you in great company, right? Here's Peter, the person who the Catholics identify as the first pope, and he was super confused by God saying that God's love goes to everybody. But I do want to point out something about this scenario. I believe that a part of the reason why it was so confusing to Peter was that he was doing this alone. He didn't have anyone to bounce it off of. He couldn't be like, did you see that sheet? He was confronted with new, shocking information, and he didn't have anyone to round those edges off of. I've mentioned this before in the past, but one of the real driving forces behind why we think the venues is critical is we need people to help unpack these ideas with. Otherwise, we become cynical. I mean, if you haven't checked the world around us right now, it's really, really, really messed up. And when we do it by ourselves, when we're like, well, none of this makes sense, it can feel almost impossible. But here at the venues, we value curiosity and skepticism. And this is kind of a thought that I have as to why we do curiosity and skepticism here and how it prevents us from cynicism is this, that the difference between skepticism and cynicism is that skepticism is questioning done in community, while cynicism never moves beyond the individual. We can be curious and skeptical over a cup of coffee, but most of the time, cynicism finds us in a stew. Right? We just find ourselves sitting there and processing, and we don't have anyone to process it with. That's why here at the venues, we do things like connection groups or dinners for 8 or bar church or the wide variety of other things. Find someone else to bounce ideas off. Go volunteer on a Thursday night to help feed our unsheltered friends and talk to the people at the venues during that time. There's a lot of hard questions that we have because change will occur, but at least this way you have people to process it with. And that's the last big movement I want to make on today's discussion is this, that when change is done in community, it can be both clarifying and more inclusive. Okay? So that when change is done in community, it can be both clarifying and more inclusive. In this story, Peter is frustrated and confused. And then there's a knock at the door at the house that he's staying, and it's a couple of friends from this Roman centurion guy named Cornelius, and they've just come to his house because Cornelius sent them to go find Peter. And so Peter gets up, and the next morning, Peter and these friends of Cornelius head over to Cornelius' house, and they have a very strange first meeting. It says this, that as Peter entered his home, Cornelius fell down at his feet and worshiped him. But Peter pulled him up and said, "Stand up. I'm a human being just like you." This is a very awkward first greeting for someone, right? I don't know how often this happens to you. It's never happened to me. Like I show up at someone's house and they worship me. But by the way, I think there's something that so many Christians could learn from this when it comes to people of different faith backgrounds. Just to look at people and say, I see you and you're a human just like me, trying to figure out what love looks like, trying to figure out what it looks like to follow the path of the divine. But it's this weird occurrence that happens. Even though it's a uniquely weird experience, I do think it's very common to something many of us are feeling right now. Because trying to connect with people feels awkward. It's weird because we don't have those connections necessarily, especially for people that you don't have the same background with. It's kind of like Janet asking if she needed to kiss him with more tongues, right? How do I do this? I've never done this before. You know, a lot of our society now is built in a way that is not compatible with meeting and engaging with new people. A recent article by Sarah Boza, who's a relationship consultant in Australia, laid out some of the reasons why so many of us are hesitant to reach out and start a new relationship. And while the context for her writing this is about dating, I think it applies to all of the ways that we engage with each other. She said this, financial stress shrinks cognitive bandwidth. When your brain is stuck in scarcity mode because you're worried about rent or groceries or bills, you're not wired for connection. You're wired for survival. Burnout makes it worse. Post-pandemic, fatigue is still hanging around. Financial fear also makes us more risk averse. When everything else in life feels unstable, taking a chance on a stranger, not exactly a top priority. But as low of a priority as it can feel, I think that we know intrinsically that there is something beneficial about these kinds of connections. Janet, who is a robot, by the way, gets this in The Good Place. So I want you to take a quick look at one last video today that shows how she kind of understands the importance of connection. I love the fact that Janet, who is a robot, understands that when we have the most vital, important conversations, like what does this all mean? And it's all pandemonium, that she understands that we can do this together. I also think that's what happens to Peter in our story, by the way. After the awkward first moment when Cornelius tries to worship him, here's how the story ends. It said, so they walked together and went inside where many others were assembled, and Peter told them, it's against our laws for a Jewish man to enter a Gentile home like this or to even associate with you. And then here's a sentence that's worth the price of admission. But God has shown me that I no longer think of anyone as impure or unclean. I see very clearly that God shows no favoritism. Yeah. One of the things I appreciate most about the story about Peter is that he was told something by God, but he was by himself, so he didn't quite understand how it all played out. And then when he was put together with people who had different backgrounds than he did, it rounded out the change and made it clarifying and inclusive. I wonder how often that happens to us, right? We have a mindset that goes one direction, then we get exposed to new thoughts, and it changes the way that we think about the world. I was hanging out with someone a couple of weeks ago who had started spending time on Thursday night with the unsheltered population here, and he was telling me that, it really opened his mind to see the way that that happened. Or even just like last week, there was the Kids Venue talent show in here, and afterwards, there was an individual who came up to Amy and was like, even though I don't have kids, I'd like to volunteer back there because what's happening here is really awesome. When we get exposed to people who have different backgrounds, yeah, that's awesome, by the way. We should give it up for that individual. When we get exposed to people who have different backgrounds than us, we don't have to become a part of that group. My friend didn't have to become unsheltered in order to deal with this. This person didn't have to have kids to see the importance of what's happening in Kids Venue. But it can absolutely open up our world and make things here much more inclusive. To finish this up, a couple of weeks ago, there was an individual who was here for the first time who's agnostic. And I told her after she showed up that I was so thankful she was here. And she showed me something that I'd never seen before. She'd heard that I had quoted Richard Rohr. She said, do you know an author by the name of Cynthia Bourgeault? I said, I've never heard of them. She's like, well, they write a lot along with Richard Rohr. And Bourgeault actually wrote something about this topic that I think is so helpful. She said, Peter was open to the new thing God was doing in their midst. Community identity was able to expand to embrace the new reality that God was clearly bringing into being. The earliest Christians refused to enshrine their identity into fixed laws and immutable practices. Instead, they found their identity in deep trust and confidence in the work of God's Spirit in unexpected and surprising ways. Today, Christians must acknowledge that God's Spirit is at work in places that we might find astonishing. Look, get it, change isn't easy. I will probably never like the taste of butter. But it doesn't change the fact that we can't stop change. We're going to see change, we're going to experience change, but rather the question is, how are we going to respond to change? When we meet people outside of our normal framework, it can help expand our understanding of each other and the divine even better. I love what happens to Peter. I love what happens to Janet. I love what Cynthia Bourgeault says, namely that this isn't something new, right? That from the beginning, following the path of Jesus said to be much more inclusive and expansive. And so today, as we close, I'm going to say this as a prayer over us, and merely this, that we would find ways to be astonished by people who are different than us, and that by being exposed to people who are different than us, we can embrace the change that we see and really move to a place where that change is both clarifying and inclusive.